Hello and welcome to the video to accompany the study guide of Chapter 7 of The Woman in Black. So this chapter is entitled Mr. Jerome is Afraid, and it turns out that in this chapter, Mr. Jerome is afraid. So Arthur has woken up the morning following his encounters with the ghostly figure of the woman in black, first named so in chapter 5, and her influence over the world seems to have extended to some kind of event out on the marshes where Arthur, attempting to get away from Eelmarsh House, is trapped by the mists. Hears the sound seemingly of a pony and trap being caught in the quicksands and their occupants drowning to death. And Arthur is forced to return to Eelmarsh House and is in an anguish and terrible state because of all the things that have happened. And then he comes to the realization that actually this didn't happen. It was a ghostly sound. It was something supernatural. And he's decided that he's going to run away. That's it, he's done. And then he changes his mind. He says he's not. And he decides actually he's going to stay behind and confront these things. And he goes to confront Mr. Jerome and goes on a bike ride. So not a lot happens in this chapter, actually. And that is significant for a reason. So he wakes up and he's convinced, when he initially wakes up, that actually he's going to run away. It's interesting. You see a lot of Arthur's internal thought processes throughout the whole novel. He's the first person narrator. He's narrating what he's thinking and feeling at the time. But he often is quite analytical about what's going on, and this chapter is no different. And there's quite a large chunk given over to the beginning of the chapter where he discusses with us, the reader, what he's thinking, the fact that he has encountered things he doesn't know how to deal with. And the only recourse is to run away. It's quite sensible, really. However, as is the case in this novel, whilst Arthur hasn't slept well, he does. He has a bath, he refreshes himself, has a good breakfast, and begins to feel actually a lot better. And engages in a kind of cheerful piece of small talk with the landlord, who says, "Oh, you should try, riding out." And he says, "Oh, I don't ride." And he says, "Oh, hey, I've got a bike I can lend you." And he's like, "Oh, brilliant." And then Arthur says to himself, "Moreover, now I knew I was not going to run away, because clearly having a bicycle makes you immune from haunting. It repels vampires, and bicycles can also stop zombies. It's a little known fact. That's why you don't see any supernatural interference in the Tour de France. No ghosts, no vampire attacks. So, no, it doesn't really, does it? But for some reason, this whole thing comes together and makes Arthur think, "Oh, I can do this." It's really an example of the environment manipulating Arthur's feelings, the author manipulating Arthur's feelings through the environment. If Arthur was sensible and ran away, we wouldn't have a story. That's the whole point. Characters in ghost stories and horror films, if they're sensible, ghost stories don't happen. Horror films don't happen. Ooh, there's a terrible noise in the basement of haunted house. Should we go downstairs and see if it's a ghost that's going to kill us? Oh, good idea. Let's do that. A sensible character would go, "No, let us run far away." But if that happened, then there would be no story. And the fact is, Arthur has to go and confront these things. And partly it's because his worldview doesn't allow him not to. Mostly it's because that's how the story's written. You have to remember that Hill is doing this deliberately, and she deliberately has to have a rational protagonist who's going to change his mind about running away and go back and etc., etc. The whole story unfolds as a result. But what is manipulating Arthur as a character in the novel is the environment. The pathetic fallacy here works to change Arthur's mood. Sometimes, as we've said, the pathetic fallacy is a reflection of a character's mood. In this instance, it is manipulating his mood. So Arthur then goes to speak to Mr. Jerome about the Drablow estate and the events that he's experienced at the house. And that's the next thing we see, is that he goes, right, I'm just going to go talk to him. I'm going to see if I can get some help. See if someone will come and help me clear these papers and get this all sorted as quickly as I can. And Arthur pushes the point about, yeah, look, I've seen and heard some things. Come on. We both know something's going on out there. And he tells Mr. Jerome that he's going to confront whatever's there. Jerome keeps talking about saying, like, you'll not find anyone who'll come with you. No one's going to go. And he says, oh, well, I know why, because I've seen the things. I know the stories. And you actually get Mr. Jerome giving out enough information that it's fairly obvious something is going on, that he knows something is going on, that both he and Arthur are talking around a subject they both have some kind of knowledge of. And Mr. Jerome even acknowledges that Arthur had seen something, the woman in black specifically, at the funeral, mentions it. And it's the closest we ever see to Arthur getting a specific and direct warning. And Mr. Jerome says, I once thought as you did, and I was wrong. He doesn't go quite as far as saying that. He says, so I thought once too. This meek, mild, broken man, and essentially Arthur ignores him. Why? Because he knows better. He looks at Mr. Jerome and sees him as someone who's been beaten and broken, and Arthur refuses to be that guy. And of course, we know that Arthur will be that guy. That actually, Mr. Jerome is Arthur's future. He just is. That is what will happen to Arthur. A man who'll be broken by his experiences. So after all of this, Arthur then goes for a bike ride. So not a lot happens in this chapter. The thing to really pay attention to here is the whole point of this chapter is it's to do two things. It's part of the overall narrative structure where we get this sawtooth with rising tension and then falling tension, rising tension, falling tension. It doesn't fall all the way back to zero because we're at a kind of, our baseline of tension might have started here, but by the time we're partway through the novel, it is a lot higher. But we get this sawtooth tension, release, tension, release, tension, release, and that you'll see several times throughout the novel, these peaks and troughs. And at the minute, we're in a falling action, a reprieve from the tension. So things are not happening. However, what we are also getting is something called exposition. We're not getting someone telling the story. That happens much later. We do get very detailed exposition, but there's hints and elements of the story being given to us in a way that we can start to put together the background for ourselves in detail. And we've got the pathetic fallacy, as I mentioned before. The pathetic fallacy is back. Arthur's being manipulated by environmental factors into changing his mind and deciding that actually I can deal with this. The foreshadowing, as I said just before, that is Arthur's future. Arthur's future is the future of Mr. Jerome. Mr. Jerome also once thought that he could face out the terrors of Marsh House, or that seems to be the implication of what's being said. And he is now a middle-aged lawyer who is broken and suffers from nervous disorders. Sound familiar? Jerome is the 35-year-old Arthur that Arthur reflects on and says, that I remember I was a dull dog. I was a man of very little, I'd suffered from nervous illnesses, etc. He describes himself like that in his middle years. That's in chapter 1. So here you have Jerome, who is essentially a cipher for Arthur. He's the Arthur that will be in 10 years' time following these events. The little picture there, clever bit of foreshadowing. For those of you who aren't aware, that there is the young Anakin Skywalker from episode 1, The Phantom Menace, and that shadow there represents Darth Vader, the shadow of the character that he will become. So that's foreshadowing. Sorry, that is a really geeky reference, but there you go. But that's an example of what's happening here. Here you have Mr. Jerome and Arthur looking at Mr. Jerome saying, you're a broken man. I know better than this. And in reality, actually, what he's doing is he's staring directly at his own future. And we see the rational protagonist at work here. This is Arthur. Even though Arthur has clearly recognized that these events are supernatural, he's still attempting to some extent to apply his version of logic. He seems to think that there's a kind of causal thing going on. He's, well, they can't hurt me. It's just noises. I've been out there. I was frightened, but that was all there was. He's still attempting to solve the problem using his powers of deduction, of logic, using his role as a lawyer to try and confront this situation. He's trying to apply his worldview to a world which he already now knows is very different. Why? Because that's the kind of thing that he's going to cling to help him deal with the situation that he finds himself in. So let's have a look at some key quotations. This is a really interesting one because he's talking about the idea that they're inexplicable, incapable of proof, and yet so deeply affecting. And actually, that's the reason why they're deeply affecting, because they run contrary to the nature of Arthur's character. That's what makes them incredibly affecting in the first place. Because they're unknown, they're unknowable. Someone who is rational really struggles with that. Can't cope with the idea that there's something beyond their experience. Here, I love this. This is another example of not so much the conspiracy of silence now, but it's this example of how the people of Crith and Gifford have come to talk around the subject. They recognize it. They know that clearly Arthur is going through things. They're not going to talk about it, but they will assist him. They care for Arthur. They look after him. They do their best to warn him off, but they won't openly warn him for whatever reason. You'll find out later that it's simply their way of coping. But here we have this fantastic line, I'd rather that than have you spend an uncomfortable night anywhere else. You get that pause there. You've got that ellipsis, which indicates that lengthy pause, and you've got the repetition of Anne there that shows the dialogue representing the fact that the landlord is thinking very carefully about how he's going to phrase this, and decides on an uncomfortable night anywhere else rather than saying spend a night in the haunted house. He kind of goes for this very neutral phrase, which indicates clearly he sees that it was going to be a bad thing for Arthur to spend the time there, but won't come out and say it. So it's not really. I mean, we term it the conspiracy of silence, but in this instance, it's not a conspiracy against Arthur. It's just a conspiracy that, an agreement, I suppose, that the townsfolk just don't talk about this situation. The amazing restorative power of the bicycle. The idea of bicycling for an hour or so is extremely cheering. Moreover, and this is the bit where he goes, moreover, Hill manipulates Arthur, gives him environmental factors that contribute to his making a really catastrophically poor set of decisions. And the bike represents a kind of a false sense of security, which we'll see in the coming chapters as well. It gives Arthur a confidence. There are several elements in the novel that give Arthur a confidence that he really should not have. But again, people who make good decisions make for very poor characters in horror and ghost stories, etc. So here we've got a nice quotation representing Arthur's confrontation with Mr. Jerome, and also representing how Arthur realizes that what he's encountered was real, but was supernatural. And here we've got the I must face it out. So I said. Mr. Jerome was looking at me pityingly. So I said once. So this is the moment when Arthur this is the closest we get to a warning. We get that very obvious and clear hint that, I did that, didn't end well for me. Don't recommend you try it either. And again, as I said earlier, this is the thing that shows us that Jerome is Arthur's future. This is a good quotation here as well. it just it shows Arthur's arrogance. It shows Arthur he had been weakened and broken by what? A woman, a few noises. This is Arthur's attitude. It's really indicative of this kind of like class divide and this sense of superiority that Arthur feels because he comes from the cosmopolitan London and they know better. And he even says it earlier in the novel, talking about the Londoner's sense of superiority. It's a really perfect example of that fatal combination of arrogance and rationality that Arthur seems to possess. And finally, this is a brilliant. This is the kind of the penultimate paragraph, the entire paragraph I've quoted here in this chapter, where Arthur is obviously aware that things are different. He realizes he's gone through something and that he's now kind of in a different state of being. He's looking at the world differently, and this last sentence is amazing. I felt older, like a man who was being put to trial, half fearful, half wondering, excited, completely enthralled. This is a clear indication that something has absolutely got hold of Arthur. You might perhaps use the word possessed, enchanted, entrapped, enthralled. To be enthralled to something means you are under its power, and that is a really clear indication of what's happened here. The woman in black almost seems to be, or the entire kind of environment surrounding the woman in black here, Marsh is sort of drawing Arthur in. It's the metaphor of the pitcher plant that I use in one of the earlier videos. It's drawn Arthur in, and he's almost to an extent enjoying this. And here's a really strange thing. He kind of seems to think that it seems to be, he describes it as exciting. It's an extraordinary thing because he obviously recognizes that it's a terrible, dangerous, and frightening thing, and that the world is a different one to the one that he understood. This is a really good example of what you would describe as the sublime. Okay, it's this theme in Gothic literature, romantic literature, of something that is powerful, affecting, really overwhelming emotion, but one that is beyond the ordinary and not exclusively negative. But there you go. This is a fantastic quotation, a really good line. And like I say, I think this is a nice literary allusion to that concept of the sublime. So there you have it. Chapter 7. Thank you very much for listening.